The N64, the beast of the dawn of 3D gaming. Gone were the days of the 2D platformer, in were the days of 3D worlds to run around and explore in. Except some developers seem not to have got the message, leading to 5 whole 2D platforms on the system. Yes, technically they're 3D models, but we won't worry about that today. Instead, we're taking a look at these 5 games in a genre which didn't really make a proper comeback until much later in gaming. The first game is Tigger's Honey Hunt, developed by Doki Denki Studio and published by Disney Interactive in North America and Ubisoft in Europe in the year 2000. Based on the popular kids franchise Winnie the Pooh, this is a pretty basic kids platformer, not a whole bunch to see. It has very straightforward gameplay with very little in the way of challenge. You have to get to the end of the level with the correct amount of honey pots in order to progress. Apart from the typical 2D platforming shenanigans, you also have the option to help one of the Pooh characters, Pooh, find something in the level. And then there are also Polaroid photos to collect. Collecting these can unlock bonuses like time trials and artwork. There is a small amount of exploration too, as there often aren't enough honeypots along the main path to progress to the next level, so you have to keep an eye out on your way or else go back and check for any areas you might have missed. There are also little mini-games after every 2 or so levels, where you play Simon Says, Rock Paper Scissors, or this weird water racing game, which I thought was fishing at first, but is actually way less entertaining. As you go through the game, you unlock 1 or 2 extra abilities which allow you to access hidden areas, or which add a new dimension to gameplay like jumping higher or hovering briefly. It's a very short game, being so straightforward it only takes about 45 minutes to complete. It's also very hard to lose. Never mind that. The level settings get gradually darker, less green and scarier as you go through the game, which is a nice touch, but overall the levels are pretty stock grass levels and not very interesting. The music is kinda catchy, but nothing special. Overall, it's not bad for what it is. This was meant as an easy game for kids who like Winnie the Pooh, and it succeeds in that goal, but it won't be of much interest to someone coming back to the game today. Apparently the PS1 and PC versions had little clips of the cartoons which the N64 lacks, so if you do have a kid who's a fan of the cartoon, you should probably go for either of those versions instead. Another kids game is Kirby 64 The Crystal Shard, developed by HAL Laboratory, published by Nintendo in the year 2000 in Japan and later elsewhere. Kirby needs no introduction, but in this iteration you play the little pink puffball, trying to save the planet Ripple Star by collecting crystal shards which have been scattered around the galaxy. Kirby, along with Yoshi as we'll see, seem to be the only beloved Nintendo characters who resisted the urge to become controllable in 3D and stayed as 2D characters, albeit with new 3D models. The gameplay is pretty standard Kirby fare. You rampage through a level and swallow all who oppose you, feeding on their essence, adjoining their power to yours, only growing stronger while destroying all in your path. And there's also these little stars to collect, which is cool. You can swallow multiple enemies' powers and combine them into new powers, which adds a fun element to the game. There are 6 levels with 4 or 5 stages each before the final boss, with stages getting harder as you go, but nothing here is going to bother you too much. This is for gamers who want a nice relaxing game without much strife. There are a few different level elements to keep the game interesting, which adds a bit more depth than the Tigger game, but this is still a simple, straightforward game. The settings are all pretty standard platform settings, caves, grassland, deserts, but the graphics are bright and cheery and look good, and the music is always upbeat and adds to the atmosphere, while still not being anything special. There are also 3 mini-games which are fun and definitely worth the inclusion. A racing game, a collect the falling apples game, and a game where you destroy the floor beneath your opponents in an attempt to make them fall to their doom. These will extend the playtime of the game and are fun in their own right, but probably won't keep you coming back to Kirby 64 after you've completed the main game, when there are many better minigame collections out there. This is still a young kids game, so it's quite basic and easy, and will only take you about an hour or 2 to finish. That said, the combining powers mechanic is cool and adds a bit more depth to the gameplay. It makes you want to get them all to see the cool new powers, but despite that, it's still a pretty average slow-paced platformer, but it got okay reviews at the time. I haven't played the other Kirby, so I don't know how it stacks up against them, but it will probably be worth it for fans of the series. For some reason, Nintendo produced 2 of the 5 2D platforms on the system. I guess they couldn't let the 2D habit die. This time it's Yoshi's Story, the sequel to the popular Yoshi's Island on the SNES, developed and published by Nintendo and released in 1997 in Japan and 1998 elsewhere. This has a very similar game structure to its predecessor, although you'll be glad to know there is no screeching baby Mario. Instead, baby Bowser has stolen the island's super happy tree. Yes, that's the name. Which, hence the name, makes all the dinosaurs on the island happy. So the little dinosaurs make their way through the island on their way to baby Bowser's lair in order to rescue it, while trying to stay happy along the way.
Repressing emotions, now with the Nintendo seal of quality. In order to stay happy, the dinosaurs can eat the fruit they see along the way, which is the same as regaining health. In terms of gameplay, you can eat your enemies, turning them into eggs that you can use to throw at objects, collect fruit, or kill other enemies, just like the SNES version. However, there is less depth to this edition, with the objective not being to reach the end, but to collect enough fruit to surround your screen. And believe me, you won't find any absence of fruit to collect. The stuff is everywhere. The levels are also shorter and less interesting, with there generally being even less challenge than the SNES version, which was already a pretty easy game. There is, however, a bit of extra depth which is not attached to the story, so it's technically extra, but it's so substantial that you really miss a lot of the game if you don't pursue it. In each level you can collect hearts, which will reveal extra levels within each world. If you don't do this, you skip straight to the next world once you collect enough fruit to surround your screen. These levels are also the hardest, so it makes the game quite shallow if you don't go out of your way to reach them. You can also gain a higher score if you collect the fruit in a certain order and focus on the level's favourite fruit, which changes each time you play. The controls, meanwhile, are a bit imprecise. I found myself slipping around a bit while playing, having to readjust my position a lot, and falling off platforms when it felt like I should have stayed on. You can still hover for a second like the previous game, which can sometimes be helpful but felt a lot less useful than the prequel, and I didn't find myself using it very often. Despite the extra content you can find by searching out the hidden levels, the main objective is to collect all the fruit rather than figure your way to the end, which will only take a few minutes. Personally, I would have preferred if the extra content had been incorporated into the story. That way you feel like you're achieving something as you go, rather than going back to clean up stuff left behind after a party. But maybe that's just me. Every song on the soundtrack is a remix of the first level's track, and while it adds atmosphere, it won't have you coming back to listen to it in your own time. However, the music changes dynamically throughout the level, depending on your health, and cuts out entirely when you have no health, which is a cool touch. The graphics have a pop-up storybook style, which is well done and fits with the aesthetic of the Yoshi game. While this game has more depth to it than the previous games in this video, it's still a very simplistic game aimed at young children and won't provide much challenge for most people. Though it is still considered a good game in the series, it's more of a game like Kirby that you play to unwind and relax, rather than to challenge yourself. It's still not as appealing as the SNES version in my opinion, however. Mischief Makers from Treasure, published by Enix and released in 1997, is an interesting game which actually did something different with the genre, just as it seemed to be getting relegated to handhelds and retro systems. You control a mecha bot who has come to save her creator, Professor Theo, who was captured while visiting planet Clancer, recently conquered by an evil invader who has enslaved much of the populace. The interesting part is that the game is based around jumping and grabbing those giant floating spheres and using them to get around the level. You grab onto the spheres and often have to shake them to get them to move, unlock new pathways, or alter the world around you in some way, all the while chanting the iconic shake shake, which the game became known for. Most levels are quite small and often involve some simple puzzle as you progress. There are also action levels, however, with time limits or boss fights. Despite the interesting concept, the controls are a bit clunky. It takes a little while to get used to, though not that long, but even when you do, you never really get into a flow with them, and often miss your target, or when you do get to the target, it feels like you shouldn't have. Sometimes it felt like I wasn't going to make the jump, so I started preparing again for the next jump, but then it turned out I had actually made the jump, causing me to fall because I had let go of the button. The game is also very short and easy and won't take long to beat, though it's harder than the previous games mentioned. While the devs clearly made an effort to change up the gameplay in different levels, the jumping and catching can get a bit stale, and the controls aren't good enough to make it a good platformer outside of this main mechanic. The graphics, it has to be said, are not great, with a static background, no scrolling, and fairly ugly textures being used. There is also this constant jerking back and forth whenever your character turns. The blocks and balls also look like some kind of regurgitation from the underworld. This is kind of the intent, seeing as they've all been possessed, but it doesn't look great in practice. The music is also nothing to write home about. They're fairly dull, monotonous tunes that don't change often enough. Still, the game definitely has its charm and character and will appeal to those who like that in a game. The NPCs are likeable and you can even pick them up and throw them into walls, which is always a fun feature. Mischief Makers didn't do too well at the time, for the previously mentioned reasons, but also just because it was an innovative 2D platformer when 3D platformers were all the rage. It's seen a bit of a resurgence in popularity, however, exactly for its innovative design and novel gameplay. It's definitely a unique game and worth the play, but it's not really a game that will leave you dying to come back for more. Full points for effort though. Mystical Ninja 2, starring Goemon, known as Goemon's Great Adventure in North America, is a sequel to the earlier Goemon game Mystical Ninja, developed and produced by Konami, released first in 1998. It's also a co-op platformer, the only co-op 2D platformer on the system. It's really worth playing just for that alone. If I'm not mistaken, this is the last time we would see a co-op 2D platformer until New Super Mario Bros. On the Wii. After you beat the game, you can even unlock 4-player co-op. The game pits you as Goemon and Ebisumaru as you try to stop Beastmaru, who has resurrected an evil demon and now threatens the world. Apart from avoiding or killing enemies, you have to collect enough door passes in each world in order to progress to the next, while occasionally taking on a boss of some sort. You generally collect door passes by finishing each stage, but you will also need to go into villages in each world and complete quests in order to collect enough passes to progress. So the game is not just about platforming. The quests include things like killing monsters for an old man,
or interacting with the villagers in town.
There is also a day-night cycle, so some quests can only be completed at certain times, and the enemies in the main level will also differ depending on when it's day or night. You can also change your character at special character changing stations dotted around each world. The game is set in ancient Japan and has a distinctive surreal humour, with science fiction elements like robots or spaceships thrown in for good measure. There are also some standard RPG elements like eating or sleeping to regain health, or you can just read the NPC's witty dialogue if you prefer. The game does a good job in creating interesting towns for you to wander around, and the little bits of humour will be appreciated. The graphics are great, with the villages having a real ancient Japanese charm, and even NPCs being given a real personality. There was also clearly real effort taken with the music, with each track fitting the game well, with an ancient Japanese style but with various modern elements thrown in, while the boss battle themes really get you excited for the duel. This game was quite popular at the time and has gained a bit of a cult following after, as an interesting 2D platformer with an interesting theme and world. The platforming is fun and the levels are interesting and have a good flow to them. The day-night shift is also interesting and adds an extra element to the gameplay, while the questing and town parts break up the action elements so they don't get stale. And the dialogue and world building give something to explore for those who are into that. However, the balance isn't perfect, with a few difficulty spikes in parts and some levels going on for way too long. Despite that, I would still recommend this game for anyone into the genre. So there you have it, 5 games in a genre most people don't think of when they think of the N64. The 2D platformer more or less died in this generation, not to stage a comeback until at least the 7th gen, but there were still a few holdouts which survived. Thanks for watching.